So I'll have the user's web browser, I guess, on the left side here. So we started with someone's laptop, and there's a web browser here. So this is a browser. And we first started with a real crash course in HTML and CSS. So HTML and CSS gives you the presentation, the layout layer behind web pages. So that's the very first thing you learn. You have a text editor, you open it up, you write some HTML and CSS code, and you have a static web page display. You have text, you might be able to include some images, you can style the fonts and the sizes and everything. And you can test this all within your browser. So this is kind of the step 0 of web programming. You got to at least be able to display a web page. Now, HTML and CSS are the kind of foundational technologies behind the layout, but if you find that a lot of times in professional web development, people aren't just writing HTML and CSS by hand. You can imagine this being very slow and tedious, especially because HTML is really verbose, and CSS, if you notice, has a lot of weird quirks and limitations. So people in industry have developed various wrappers around HTML and CSS, developed rendering engines, they develop other languages that actually compile into CSS, so you write in some other language. They've developed GUI frameworks where you can drag and drop things and put stuff together in HTML and CSS. So you might find that in your jobs you won't actually be writing it by hand, but it was really important to teach these fundamentals because that's what everything ends up compiling into, right? Everything goes into HTML and CSS on the web page eventually, so it's good to see the fundamentals. The next step we added was JavaScript. So JavaScript is the de facto language in web browsers because that's the only language really that runs inside of a web browser. So remember, there's the browser itself runs only one language, and it's called JavaScript. And it has all these weird quirks to it. It's been developed over 20 years. Like it or not, that's what the language people use for the web. We didn't really write in raw JavaScript, right? So if I wanted to really do this really bare bones approach, we would just write in raw JavaScript. But as you see, in different browsers implement JavaScript differently, and it's really annoying to do certain things. So we added this layer, this really thin library called jQuery on top of JavaScript. So jQuery is so widely used now. It's been in use for about a decade, and it's used in like 50, 60, whatever % of websites, that it's practically like a part of the JavaScript language, even though technically it's not part of the language. It's a library you put on top of the language, right? And remember, the way to include jQuery is either download it, or if you don't want to download it, you just put a link to like a web version of jQuery. So it's like super simple to install. So when people normally say JavaScript, they kind of really a lot of times mean JavaScript and jQuery together in one, even though it's, the language is still JavaScript. And the nice thing about jQuery is it gives you this nice unified interface for selecting DOM elements, for doing AJAX requests, for doing button click handlers and other sorts of events. And it makes things in JavaScript so much smoother and easier. So you can do all this stuff just in JavaScript, right? jQuery is just a library on top of JavaScript. It doesn't provide any extra magic. It just makes it a bit easier. And there are a lot of JavaScript libraries that people end up using in industry. That's not jQuery. There are other layers on top of jQuery or other kinds of libraries people use. But jQuery was sort of the most minimalist one that was both good for teaching and actually is fairly practical. So with that, we have the front end, right? So the first few weeks, we covered the front end technologies, which is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, jQuery. And the nice thing about all this is that this all runs in the browser, right? You don't need a web server or a hosting service or anything. You don't even need to install a thing on your computer. You just have a text file, you edit it, and you just reload it and run it. So that's really nice, and it's really easy to set up. And with technologies we learned in the second half, like local storage or session storage, you can actually build fairly rich apps just in the browser itself. So you normally think of web apps as having a server component, but actually if you want something for yourself, if you're building something just for yourself, I give a to-do list or a personal information manager as a canonical example of a personal project you build for yourself. Like I want to track all my to-dos or my errands and stuff. You can actually build that as an HTML, CSS, JavaScript app on your own computer, and you just use the local storage in your browser to store everything, so that when you close your computer and you open it again, you go to the same page, and there you go. You have all your stuff. So you actually can build a real app using this for yourself, and it's actually quite much. I would say it's much easier than building, say, a Java app or a C++ app or whatever, because you have all the GUI stuff right there. So this is all good for a single person, but obviously you want to put this on the internet so other people can use it. So then in the second part, we introduced a server component. So this is what we call usually the client, the browser, and this is the server. So the server is connected to the client on the internet somewhere, and the server I represent is this big like thing, which is, it's basically a computer. Right? A server is just a computer that has a usually fast internet connection. And the client connects to the server via the browser, and they communicate through this protocol called HTTP. And this is the central glue that binds all of the internet communication together. So all the stuff that people build on top of web applications, they're just communicating using straight HTTP for the most part. So the server has something that understands HTTP, and it has programs or scripts that run on it. So the kind of programs we wrote were called what's called CGI programs. So CGI is a very simple and old interface for running programs on the server and returning it to the client. It's actually as old as the web itself almost. So there are much more modern interfaces that people use that are not CGI. That we'll see some of this in web frameworks, but CGI has been around forever. It's well supported in basically every web server, and it provides a really clear interface. And the interface for CGI is, as you've seen, is painfully simple, which is just printing stuff, right? All CGI is you just have a program and you just print whatever you want to the terminal. But instead of printing the terminal, when you're running it through a web server interface, the print statements go directly through HTTP to the user's browser. So whatever you want to print, just print it, and it just goes to the browser. And it's up to the browser to interpret what you printed. So you remember you have this header, you have this HTTP header you have to print out that tells you the type, and then you don't forget the new line or else your thing crashes. And then you print out the contents of your HTML. Or if you want to print JSON data, you print a string that's the JSON data, you bring it back. All it is just printing. And so CGI can be used in any language that can run on your server. So servers are usually running Linux nowadays, but there are servers that run Windows and servers that run Mac. But for a lot of servers that are on hosting services, Linux is the standard operating system. So any programming language that runs on your operating system can be used for CGI. So we chose Python because it's just a language a lot of people are familiar with. Also has good libraries for interfacing with CGI and cookies and sessions and JSON and all these other things. But you could use other languages like Perl, like Ruby, like PHP, like whatever you really want. I mean, whatever language you want, as long as it can like print stuff, you're pretty good, right? You can just use it through this interface. So this is a very bare bones interface. I would say that probably no real modern website uses CGI anymore because it's pretty slow, relatively slow. Simple sites use it, but if you're doing production scale, you're probably not using CGI. The biggest limitation of CGI is that every time a request comes in, it actually launches a new program. Imagine you have a Python program or a Ruby program that's running in CGI. If you have one request come in, it actually launches a new program on the computer to handle it. And if you have 10,000 users hitting your site simultaneously, it's launching 10,000 programs simultaneously. So you can imagine how that doesn't scale. So real production web servers usually use an approach where they don't launch a separate process or program for every request that comes in, because you can imagine it overwhelming the OS. But for the purposes of this class, for educational purposes, CGI is fine, and it can handle hundreds of simultaneous requests and stuff. I mean, you're not going to be able to build Facebook or Twitter off it, but for the kind of traffic you're getting for your class projects, it's perfectly all right. And then the last thing that part of this web programming stack is a database, right? So we use SQLite as a database. Actually, before we even use SQL, we just use files, right? Remember the data storage lecture, because the simplest way to actually store data on the server is you just write stuff to a file and read some from a file. And that's, files are meant for storing data persistently, so you can just have your script in whatever language, just read and write from files. That works perfectly until you have multiple concurrent users, or you have your server crashes for some reason. So we studied how a database has advantages over just using plain files. And out of all the possible billions of databases in the world, SQLite is probably the best one for teaching because it's the simplest to set up and administer. Because SQLite is just a file, right? As you see, your SQL database is just a single file. So to back up your database, you just copy the file somewhere else. If you want to look at the database, you just open it on the command line with a file. If we had used any other database for teaching, it would probably take a whole lecture to try to set up the database, and it probably would not work. So in production, actually, a lot of people actually do use SQLite in production, right? Because if you actually look at that website, it's the They claim it's the most widely deployed database because it's in all mobile phones, right? All iOS phones, Android phones, all these phones have SQLite in it. All web browsers have SQLite to use. I'm pretty sure that the local storage, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that local storage and session storage probably use SQLite in Firefox or Chrome. So with all this, we actually have a full stack for developing web applications. So you imagine we have HTML and CSS, we have JavaScript, we have jQuery, we have the ability to write and read HTTP requests. On the server, we have a CGI interface. We use a language such as Python. We can write to files if we want, or we can use an SQLite database. So this is all that you need to build a modern web application. So the modern web application, I call these CRUD applications plus Ajax, right? This is what you're doing for your project. All this technology we've highlighted here throughout the term is sufficient for building this. The primary downsides I would say for this would be performance, right? If you're building a production grade site off this, you probably want to use components that are a bit more sophisticated and higher performing. We also didn't talk about security, so we also didn't talk about using secure protocols and libraries and such. And also we didn't talk about kind of how do you make your programming job easier. So if you imagine if you're using this kind of bare bones interface for programming web applications, you're probably writing a lot of code, right? You're probably, in your CGI code, you have to print out the contents of all of your responses or all of your HTML pages or all of your things. You're just building up strings and printing them. And from a teaching perspective, that's powerful because all your, the main thing you're learning is that these are all just strings, right? It's just strings and strings. I mean, really, these are just bytes, right? They're just bits. Everything's just ones and zeros. I mean, everything is eventually ones and zeros, but these ones and zeros are interpreted as ASCII strings or Unicode strings, and they're sent over the wire. And there's, as far as I can tell, this is the most basic of stacks you can get away with teaching web programming in any modern way without going insane. Because if you don't have jQuery, you kind of go insane because the JavaScript is way too verbose. So that's a quick lightning summary of what we've covered in this course. So we've actually covered a lot of ground in this course in terms of giving you the tools that you need to build any modern web application.